I know Bitcoin is not the only crypto asset that you guys at Bitwise find interesting or valuable. In fact, I think, Matt, we've had you on the podcast before. We were talking about how to talk to RIAs and institutions about DeFi, decentralized finance, and some of the tokens surrounding it, and these new cash flowing assets that are not stocks, but something different, protocol network assets, something like this. So let's talk about the next set of assets that we think we can create an ETF wrapper around, like a trad ERC20, as we call it sometimes on Bankless. So the next one in line feels like it should be the Ethereum ETF. And I'm coming from the perspective that nothing else is close to that at this point in time. We don't yet have futures for any other ETF. So the next in line, apart from Bitcoin, would be the Ethereum ETF. And I want to get your take on when that's going to happen. Could it happen this year? There's been a lot of conversation about this recently. So some of the Bloomberg analysts who we've had on the podcast before recently came back and they said by May, low probability, something like 30%. I saw Jake Chervinsky and others kind of like weigh in on this as well. They think that it will be politically very difficult, probably untenable for Chair Gensler to do this with the current kind of administrative setup and some of the political pressures he feels. Let's remember, Gensler is kind of like the third vote of 5. He was the one that got majority for the Bitcoin ETF across the finish line. I know, I'm pretty sure you guys have a filing in. Is that correct? And so you don't yet?
We do not yet.
Oh,
no, we do not yet.
Okay. Is that something you want to announce, Matt, on the podcast today?
How much work is that yet work doing?
Yes. Yeah, that yet work is doing a lot of work. I mean, we've talked about it in the past. We intend to have an Ethereum ETF filing when we think it can be approved, and we're really excited about Ethereum. We love the asset, as we've discussed, Ryan. I think for many in TradFi, it's easier to get their hands around ETH and the cash flow generating nature of ETH and the real world use applications that are being built on the Ethereum network. I think that's easier for many people to understand. So we absolutely intend to be in this space. The good thing about not having a filing is I can talk about it. If I had a filing, I couldn't actually say
we have some
anything.
freedom before you file. Once you file, you'll have a little bit more closed, zipper, but now it's more open.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Once you
All right,
file,
because I've got some questions.
Let's do it.
Let's go.
Okay, so the recent meta has been a decreasing in the probability of the approval of the ETH ETF in May. I think there was something previously like 60 to 70%. Sometime late last year, early this year. Now that has decreased. You can see this in the poly market. The ETF bros, Eric and James, have also decreased their probability down to 35%. Maybe without any sort of question in specific, just like comment on that. Comment on like the likelihood of the ETH approval happening like in this year, for example.
Yeah, sure. So I can start. Ryan, you can jump in afterwards. To set up, the reason people talk about May is because ETF filings for crypto ETFs move on a 240-day review cycle. And so by the 240th day, the SEC has to say yes or no. And the first of those days ends up in May.
So May would not end up in a delay. It would end up in either an approval or a denial, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, they can't kick the can down the road after May. And that's it's a great part of the process because they have to say yes or no. The reason you're seeing the odds decrease is because Eric and others are reading the tea leaves. What are the tea leaves? Usually, when you get to this point in the process, if you're going to get an approval, you're having direct engagement with the SEC where they're asking you a bunch of questions, and then you're updating your prospectus to reflect those changes. So they'll ask you like 40 or 50 or 60 questions. And if you look back at the Bitcoin ETF approvals, what you started to see was Amendment 2 to our prospectus, Amendment 3 to our prospectus, Amendment 4, Amendment 5. Between those amendments, there's this back and forth with the SEC. And I think the reason they're downrating the likelihood, and I think the reason they're approximately accurate in those expectations is because we're not seeing any of that, right? There's no amendments. There's no discussion. There's no obvious updating of all the prospectuses at once to answer the same questions. There's just none of the indicia.
There's general indifference from the SEC.
Yeah, or they're listening, like they're in listening mode. They're meetings with the SEC, and you see them listening, and they did that with Bitcoin for years. But there's no two-way flow, and that's really what you want to see. That doesn't mean it's impossible. We're not yet in the window where it's impossible. If this were still true in late April, we'd be in the window where it's impossible, right? They just can't move that fast. At this point, it's still theoretically possible. That's why it's 35 and not 0, but it's trending down because we haven't yet seen this in the public filings. My view is that ultimately we will get an Ethereum ETF. The core logic on which the Bitcoin ETF approval rests, which is that futures and spot track each other very well and are tightly correlated, applies into Ethereum. And to give kudos to a competitor, Fidelity recently updated their filing with some really good data demonstrating this. I think it's probably the best shot on goal that the ETH world has had for a Bitcoin ETF was the new Fidelity update. So I think we'll eventually get it. I would guess I'm over 50% by the end of this year. I think it's probable this year. And I'll add one more nuance and then I'll stop talking because I've been going on for a while. I'll let Ryan speak, poor guy over there. I think Ethereum ETFs will pull in more assets if they launch in December than if they launch in May. I think TradFi is still in the process, as we discussed, of digesting this Bitcoin ETF, and they're not yet ready for the next asset. So I actually think the ETFs will be more successful at the end of the year than if they launch in May. And I think it's more likely we'll get a launch at the end of the year than we get a launch in May.
So TradFi is just like currently reeling, overwhelmed from what's going on with the Bitcoin ETF, hasn't completely processed it, still digesting it. And so it would be more bullish if we just sat on our hands as an industry and waited for them to like kind of catch up with the times. And then we can improve the ETH ETF. That's your most bullish version of the future.
That's my most bullish version of the future because Ryan can only do so many meetings and he still has to get through his Bitcoin meetings before he can do his Ethereum meetings. I mean, it's a joke, but it's true. So I do think if these launch at the end of the year and we've had Denkun and we've started to see the applications bubble up and we're getting those real world applications and user counts are growing, I think it's a perfect scenario for ETH. Of course, the sooner we get it, in some way, the better. But I do think there's a bullish case to be made for end of the year.
Bitwise, Ryan, tell us about your perspective on just the conversations around ETH and the ETH ETF as the resident boots on the ground here.
Yeah, I think that's right. You don't want to overwhelm these advisors with choices. You have to think about, even though we're talking about and researching and on Twitter talking about Ethereum every single day and talking about crypto every single day, these investors spend a very small percentage of their time actually thinking about crypto, actually thinking about investing in it. They're over there trying to grow assets. It's really a business development business when you're in the world of managing assets, and you're just trying to find clients who want to entrust you with their assets, and then you go and invest them. And if you're only investing 1% of your portfolio or 5% of your portfolio into crypto, you're spending less than that thinking about those assets as a whole, because you're spending most of your time thinking about marketing and growing your business. And so I think you have to let them get their arms around Bitcoin. When we go back to Denver, when I was in the room with that large RIA, almost every single question was about Bitcoin. And they weren't deep down the rabbit hole around Bitcoin. We were still getting questions that says, how do we know that Bitcoin isn't a Ponzi scheme? How do you know they can't increase the supply to more than 21 million, right? And these are questions that we've maybe all grappled with our first
Satoshi's just going to come and dump it all.
Yeah, exactly. And so then you try to tell them, okay, look, that's the whole case around Bitcoin is its limited supply, increasing demand. It's a commodity similar to gold. Then you try to explain Ethereum, which is this decentralized version of the internet where all these crazy crypto applications are going to be built on top of it. They don't really know how to think about that. And when they're trying to allow the Bitcoin brain drain to come in, it's really difficult to also have this new internet come in, DeFi, crypto applications. And so I think that conversation coming later would help, like Matt said, allow them to get some exposure to Bitcoin first, let that settle, let them talk to their clients about it, have some of their quarterly meetings or biannual meetings that they have with their clients to go over their portfolios. get them used to Bitcoin, and then the next best thing comes up, which is Ethereum, and they can then have that opportunity to say, look, we carved off some of your inflation hedge and we put it into Bitcoin. What if now we carve off some of your technology sleeve, maybe some of your NASDAQ sleeve, and put that into Ethereum, which is the tech version kind of the crypto ecosystem.
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.